Very pleased to have Tyler VanderWeele join us and speak with us. Tyler is the John Loeb and Francis Lehman Loeb Professor of Epidemiology at Harvard. He is the co-director of the Harvard Institute on Health, Religion, and Spirituality, and the director of the Human Flourishing Project. He has done research on causal inference in epidemiology, the study of happiness, the relationship between religion and health, as well as many other topics. Tyler is going to be speaking to us on a very topical issue at Harvard, intellectual and viewpoint diversity. Tyler's asked that he go through his presentation and that we hold questions until the end of his presentation. Floor is yours, Tyler. Take it away.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Jeff, for the kind introduction and the invitation to speak here today. And thank you all for participating. I will be speaking on intellectual and viewpoint diversity, importance, scope, and bounds. This is the first time I have presented this material publicly, so I will be very interested and keen to engage you all and your thoughts on this matter, and certainly welcome criticism and feedback. I do hope to eventually turn this into a published paper, and so very much believe in principles of free exchange of ideas and open discourse to refine thinking, as I will indeed be speaking on today. So please do bring your thoughts and criticisms to all that I will be discussing. In terms of outline of my presentation, I'll first begin with a brief overview of concepts and what I take to be definitions here, though a lot more could be said on this. I'll then present some statistics on the decline of intellectual diversity within the US academic contexts. I'll move on to talk about what I see as the importance of intellectual and viewpoint diversity for fostering the central mission of the universities, which, as I see it, is the generation, preservation, and transmission of knowledge. And then I'll move on to talk about what I would take to be reasonable ways to foster intellectual and viewpoint diversity within universities, and finally conclude with what I see is at stake concerning these issues. Two elephants in the room, which I will not be explicitly addressing here, but happy to take these up in the Q&A if so desired. First, my own experience at Harvard in 2023 came under considerable criticism, essentially for holding traditional Catholic teachings on controversial moral positions and questions over whether that should be allowed at a school of public health at Harvard, with sort of students and faculty for about 2 months trying to get my tenure revoked and being removed from the position. I think greater presence of and respect for intellectual diversity would have prevented this. But in any case, if you want a full account, I have published what took place in my critique of the administration's response in this paper at the bottom, Global Epidemiology. But again, I'm not going to be focused on my own experience here. Of course, the other big event in the room is what is currently taking place in the conflict between the US administration and Harvard. And certainly not all of this involves matters of intellectual diversity, but in both the first letter from the US administration and in the second as well, matters of intellectual diversity, viewpoint diversity did come up. In the first letter, which I thought was somewhat more reasonable, there was a request to change, to improve viewpoint diversity, to end ideologic capture. The second letter was rather more dramatic in its demands, essentially sort of requesting a ceding of autonomy of the university in this regard. On the point with respect to intellectual diversity, the demand was to audit department by department, and that there must be a reform by hiring a critical mass of new faculty to ensure viewpoint diversity in each and every department, and units that were not capable were to be transferred. So it was pretty dramatic. To my mind, President Garber really had no choice but to decline these demands. But in any case, I'm not going to be focused with my remarks on what is taking place at present within Harvard. My arguments here will be more general and sort of perhaps more optimistically focused on what I see as the potential for change coming from within the university community itself. In terms of definitions for these matters which I will be discussing, I take a viewpoint diversity to be the range of viewpoints and beliefs that are presented and engaged with in a given academic context. So viewpoint diversity really concerns the positions themselves. And I would distinguish that from intellectual diversity as sort of being the deeper concept concerning not just positions and views, but actually nature of the intellect, the mind. So the range of intellectual systems of thought held by persons or systematically presented within a given academic context. So again, either entirely systems of thought being presented or really ideally people holding these distinctive systems of thought. And so kind of the distinction between views and the people who actually hold and embody those views will be important in some of the proposals that I put forward later on. And then lastly, political or ideological diversity, I take as either intellectual or viewpoint diversity, but characterized by political or ideological commitments. And much of the existing data that we have really concerns political diversity, and I think intellectual and viewpoint diversity are much broader concepts, might concern, for example, the variation in religious views or within a particular discipline, the range of views and intellectual perspectives held within a particular department, range of views on economic theories, for example. But in any case, most of the data, again, concerns political diversity. I think there's pretty compelling evidence that at least political ideological diversity has declined over time within U.S. universities and colleges. I think the most compelling data comes from the Higher Education Research Institute, which surveyed a wide range of faculty at different institutions. The data from the academic year 1989 to 1990 suggested a liberal to conservative ratio for faculty of approximately 2 to 1. And then if we move ahead about 15 years to their same survey in 2016, 2017, not absolutely comparable because somewhat different institutions, but again, covering quite a broad range of institutions, that ratio had become essentially 5 to 1. Some evidence, again, this is a different survey yet again, but some evidence now that in the 8 years that have followed that, the ratio is perhaps around 7 to 1. One of the recent surveys of Harvard faculty suggested that at my institution, that ratio is 26 to 1. I think the most recent data I've been able to find in sort of comprehensive analysis of the trends comes from a paper by Honeycutt, 2024. And again, this is pulling together data from different sources, so it needs to be taken a little bit with a grain of salt, but one can see the trends over time from 1969 with regard to faculty who are self-identifying as liberal or far left to those who are identifying conservative or far right, kind of dramatically changing. Always a larger portion of those identifying as liberal versus conservative, but again, pretty dramatic divergence over time. There's been some discussion of the mechanisms, why this might be so. Duarte, in a paper in Psychological Science in 2015, looking just at the discipline of psychology, put forward 3 mechanisms and present data, I think reasonable data to support these. These also come up in Keith Whittington's paper on intellectual diversity as well, more of a qualitative discussion. But for selection into the profession. Those with more liberal views tend to be more inclined, it seems, towards the academic profession, and I do think this is real. But then second, less fortunately, perhaps, a hostile environment to conservatives. Recent surveys have suggested that 75% of conservative academics in the social sciences and humanities in the US and Britain say their departments are hostile to their beliefs. Slightly different survey in Lamner's 2012, simply asking, do you feel there's a hostile climate towards your political beliefs in your field? 82% of conservatives responded yes versus only 7% of liberals. And then I think the third mechanism for which there is pretty compelling evidence is discrimination. And so in that same study, in Byers and Lamner's, 1 in 3 of those who identify as liberal said that they would and do discriminate against conservatives in hiring decisions. 1 in 4 said they would discriminate in reviewing grant applications, about 1 in 5 in paper review. These are all almost certainly underestimates insofar as these are the proportions willing to admit such discrimination in surveys. Interestingly, and I think importantly, rates for discrimination of conservatives against liberals are almost identical. In this paper by Honeycutt and Fredberg, it's quite fascinating. The graphs are almost symmetrical, opposites to one another, looking at conservatives and liberals. So this notion to discriminate against those on the other side is pretty much uniform. But the current ratio in academia of liberal to conservative faculty of 7 to 1 means that most of this discrimination is operative in one direction, liberals against conservatives, simply because of the large majority of liberals currently in academic positions. But in any case, this sort of discrimination probably also contributes to the lowering rates of those with conservative viewpoints in university settings. I do think compounding this problem further, and I do think one of the chief sources of not taking this seriously and so far as I can see, really almost no efforts at any sort of correction, though we'll come back to why that might even be desirable a little bit later, is that I think there's a denial that this is an issue at all, and this has taken a variety of forms. I think most strikingly is just denying that there's really been any change. Kind of this notion, which I think is true, that there's always been more liberals to conservatives in academic circles, and this might have to do with selection into the profession, and I do think that's the case. But I do think there's also been dramatic change over time, again, from roughly a ratio of 2 to 1 to perhaps now 7 to 1. Strikingly, in this paper by Stolzenberg that's presenting the 2016-2017 Education Research Institute data, this is the data that's been used by others to establish the trend. Their section is entitled, in that paper, Majority of Faculty Identify as Politically Liberal, but not increasingly so. That's the title of the section that actually presents the data showing precisely the opposite. So I still have a little bit of a hard time believing that they were willing to state this, given the changes that were apparent in the data, but they just say, oh, the changes aren't that large. And if you look at the last 2 years, maybe there's even a slight negative downturn. But again, sort of just denial that this is so. Other work has, rather than looking over time, switched the analysis to birth cohorts and said, well, at present, younger generations and older generations aren't all that different from one another in terms of suppression of other viewpoints, so maybe we don't have a problem. But that sort of ignores the fact that both groups may have been in sharp decline over time. Yet another analysis saying this isn't a big problem says, well, sure, there's a preponderance of liberal faculty, but same with students. And so the concordance is just fine. And we'll come back to kind of discrimination on student admissions a little bit later. But a cynical take on this work would be, well, 2 forms of discrimination is better than just one. But again, there's sort of a downplaying of this issue. I think downplaying of discrimination and persecution of conservative positions in my own case, had this been a matter over race, say, and there had been the sustained effort of persecution on this matter for 2 months, the university would be in outrage. So I think many sort of will just say, well, it's not such a big problem. Yes, conservatives maybe sometimes are given a bit of a difficult time, but it's not much of an issue. I will say in my own case, some of the strongest supporters and advocates were also those who strongly disagreed with me on my position. So I think there are many wonderful faculty colleagues still present, willing to defend the need for academic freedom and intellectual diversity, but I do think this issue has been downplayed. And I do think some of it also relates to just sort of a self-satisfaction over the ideological conformity that we are in a free market of exchange of ideas, and liberal positions have won out. Isn't this wonderful? But I do think there's a real cost to the lack of intellectual diversity on campuses at present. And so I will be presenting arguments here for cost in terms of our pursuit of knowledge, in terms of that dissemination of that knowledge to the public, the transmission of that knowledge and teaching, all of which I do think ultimately affects, and I'll come back to this at the very end of the presentation, our capacity to preserve the very nature and aims of the university itself. But I'll focus, principally here on the value of viewpoint and intellectual diversity for the pursuit of knowledge itself. And really, this is just going back to John Stuart Mill's arguments, which I still find very compelling today, that we really need to encounter ideas and arguments of the opposing side so that our own thinking is refined, or when needed, corrected or changed. Likewise, so that we can refine, change, correct the thinking and positions of others. And that engagement actually leads to deeper understanding as well of our own positions and of their rational grounds, but also an understanding of the positions of others and what they take to be rational grounds, and that it furthermore enables us to find and identify areas of consensus and to find common ground and practical ways to move forward. So, often famous and often cited quote here from Mill, he who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good, and no one may have been able to refute them, but if he is equally unable to refute the reasons of the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion. So again, I think we need to encounter differing ideas for the pursuit of knowledge. If one takes knowledge as something along the lines of justified true belief, the evidence for which really cannot be overturned, that's when we can really make claims towards knowledge, when the evidence has been subjected to scrutiny and holds up. If that's what we're after in terms of knowledge, then I think we need to be subjecting our positions regularly to scrutiny. We need an academic culture where claims and evidence regularly come under scrutiny. And I think presumptions of a certain orthodoxy, which seems to have pervade many college campuses, threaten this. I think a culture of self-censorship, which I think we very much have, and I'll present data on this as well shortly, also threatens this. I think suppressing intellectual diversity threatens this. I think all of these things really do detract from our pursuit of knowledge. Each discipline is going to have its own nuances as to how this plays out. In that kind of review paper in psychology by Duarte 2015, they argue that the lack of ideological diversity in psychology, and I think they trace within their discipline a change from about 4-to-1 liberal to conservative ratio to 12-to-1 very rapidly over just a couple of decades. But they argue that this causes the following risks and threats. Liberal values and assumptions become embedded into theory itself and into methodology. Researchers may concentrate on topics that validate the liberal progress narratives and avoid topics that contest that narrative. Negative attitudes regarding conservatives can produce a psychological science that mischaracterizes their traits and attributes, results in confirmation bias, and restricts creativity within psychology. So they argue that all of these are negative effects of the increasing conformity within the discipline of psychology itself. I think ideally we want a robust intellectual environment where we care enough to want to engage with others so as to ensure that what we are putting forward really does constitute knowledge. We should want to, in some sense, encounter opposition to refine our arguments and to render those, therefore, and our position in case more persuasive. There should be sufficient confidence to confront challenges that other perspectives may pose. And there should almost be, to my mind, in a well-functioning academic setting, a sort of delight in the dissemination of ideas by the demonstration of them through their defense, through attacks and defense. I think also ideally we'd like an academic environment where we're okay with sometimes being wrong, where we have sufficient comfort to articulate positions that may sometimes be refuted. Again, ideally, I think we should welcome and even seek out opposition. This becomes very difficult when views on various matters become more uniform. So again, I think lack of ideological and viewpoint and intellectual diversity hamper the pursuit of knowledge, but I think arguments can be made that also hamper the dissemination of knowledge. And I would take the core, not the sole, but the core mission of the university to be the generation, preservation, and transmission of knowledge. That transmission includes both dissemination to the general public and also to students through teaching. And I think the lack of intellectual diversity hampers capacity to disseminate that knowledge. Public trust in universities has declined dramatically over just the last 10 years and has done so both for Republicans and Democrats. Recent Gallup polls indicated a decline from trust in higher education from 57% expressing a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in higher education in 2015 to just 36% nine years later. This is a dramatic change over a very short period of time. And when you ask the respondents for reasons for not having confidence in higher education, the two principal reasons they put forward are political agendas and teaching not having the right focus. So Whittington's article on this, and I think he handles both dissemination and teaching quite well, but he argues that that political homogeneity hampers truth dissemination functions. There's kind of a loss of trust, and there's a sense from much of the public that interests are simply not aligned, and that this then leads in turn to others approaching and turning to other sources for information, including popularizers, ideologues, charlatans, and to my mind, this is indeed happening in higher education at present. And then similar issues with regard to teaching, with regard to the transmission of knowledge to students. Political homogeneity can hamper teaching by less diverse faculty providing less diverse ideas and insights and emphases, so kind of restricting the range of what is encountered and discussed. Less capable of adequately presenting alternative viewpoints. Again, I think this can be addressed to a certain extent, even with a fairly politically homogeneous faculty, but I think it's more difficult to present alternative views when you don't have faculty that hold them. Less trust by students. Some students, at least, may be put off by what seem to be uniform ideological biases, lack of opportunities for mentorship and formation of conservative students, and that argues, what Keith Whittington further argues, that students will then turn elsewhere for guidance. So again, I think lack of ideological diversity can hamper our pursuit of knowledge, hamper the dissemination of knowledge to the public, and teaching. I think it is a difficult question as to what is to be done, and I haven't seen too many institutions implement what I think are reasonable approaches. I do think a lot of the proposals that have been put forward are not particularly good if one wants to retain a certain disciplinary autonomy and autonomy of academic institutions. So I think kind of what to do is a tricky question, but I think there are things that can be done both within the classroom regarding viewpoint diversity, even with our kind of current structures and dynamics, And then I have a proposal that'll kind of be the first 3 points, but then I have a proposal to put forward with regard to addressing more directly this question of intellectual diversity with regard to the makeup, in some sense, the constitution of the faculty themselves. I'm going to be putting forward a faculty intellectual diversity hiring principle aimed at not trying to enforce quotas and trying to respect the autonomy of each discipline and each department. And then I'll kind of turn to questions of administrators and admissions as well. But in any case, kind of 5 sets of ideas, I guess, to try to promote intellectual diversity of faculty. So again, I think it is an important question, and some of the critiques of the viewpoint and intellectual diversity arguments, I think are reasonable. What I think the questions are on what are the bounds on this are important to address. I don't think in classroom teaching, at least, all possible views should be presented. One doesn't have time, and one wants to respect the real progress that has been made in disciplines and towards knowledge. So while I certainly think there's a space on college campuses for all views to be welcome and anything to be put forward and disputed, I do think classroom teaching should have a more narrow, principled focus. I do think there should be limits to viewpoint diversity within classroom teaching. And so I think this raises difficult questions. Should all views that are held be presented? Probably not. Should all views be given equal attention? Again, probably not. We do want to respect the role of scholarship, scholarly consensus. Moreover, I think ultimately viewpoint diversity is really the means. It's not the goal. The goal is knowledge. The goal is justified true belief, the evidence for which cannot be overturned. I think that's really what we're after in an academic context. If all worked out perfectly and beautifully, sure, we would have consensus around what is genuinely knowledge. And so I think kind of viewpoint diversity is really a means towards that. It's a means to ensure we have a sense of what we really know and what is still disputed. And so again, I think these considerations lead to important questions of what sort of viewpoint diversity should we allow in practice in the classroom setting. Again, I think there's much broader scope in academic discourse generally, in debates and public lectures and so on. But with regard to the classroom, I'd put forward, and again, open for objections, refinements, dispute on this, but I'd put forward the following classroom viewpoint diversity principle. And present articulate this as follows, and grateful for the Council on Academic Freedom members at Harvard for, through discussions, helping me to sort of refine this, and I'm sure could be refined yet further. But the principle for classroom teaching would be if a lot of people believe some position X about topic Y, then a course on Y should ideally include the strongest arguments for and against position X. So it's not just a presentation of the position, but really presentation of the strongest arguments for and against the position. And so in cases where there's strong rational consensus, against a position, such as, say, with young Earth creationist views that Earth is only 6,000 years old, for example, there might not be many or any good arguments in favor, but I still think in a classroom setting it's worthwhile presenting the arguments against, presenting the position that's held by fairly substantial numbers of the American population, present the position and the arguments against, equip students to be able to present such arguments, to understand the arguments against as well. Cases where there are arguments on both sides, then both sides should be presented. And I think doing so would help better affect general societal beliefs as well. But I think more often than not, we are now frequently relying on presumption, social pressure of sort of everyone assuming they believe the same thing, eventually on sort of just self-censorship. Those who might disagree stay silent. And I think this then leads us to stop considering whether there are strong arguments in the other direction at all. I think that then further hampers our capacity to even distinguish between those cases where there are strong arguments on the other side. So I think a faculty member can take it upon self or herself to go through this exercise, but I think there should be space in the classroom to allow for arguments for a position that a faculty member may indeed have overlooked. But again, I don't think any viewpoint should be presented, but ones that are widely held in the general population, I think should come under scrutiny, even if that scrutiny is really simply to refute. I do think there are other approaches to kind of foster articulation of reasonable viewpoint diversity within classroom, even if faculty are ideologically fairly homogenous. And I think some techniques, for example, are to have students debate each other, but be randomly assigned to the positions they have to argue for. So to force students to argue for positions that might not, in fact, be their own. But I do think that exercise can be very helpful in understanding views of the other side. I think bringing in speakers with alternative views, even in formal classroom settings, can be helpful. I always find quite useful what's sometimes called the ideological Turing test. Can one summarize an opposing side's position argument sufficiently well that a neutral person could not distinguish whether the summary had been written by a person who agreed or disagreed with the position, or even stronger, so that the opposing side might even think that you agreed with the position. And I think carrying this out for both sides of an argument really can be valuable. I mean, I think sort of medieval forms of disputation here are perhaps a helpful prompt to what we need to do today, kind of always presenting the strongest arguments of the opposing side first before even articulating one's own position. But I think these sorts of techniques in classroom settings can, again, help foster an understanding of alternative viewpoints. So third, I do think there's a real role to leverage existing viewpoint diversity among faculty and among students. And I think we're not doing this well enough because of a culture of self-censorship. And this is operative both with faculty and students. Recent survey, NACUT 2024, indicated that 35% of faculty today say they've recently toned down their writing for fear of controversy. That's fourfold higher than even at the height of the McCarthy era, where only 9% said yes. So it's a problem with faculty as well, and certainly a problem with students. 40, this is national, 40% of conservative students, 21% of liberal students say they self-censor, not just occasionally, but fairly often or very often. 70% conservatives, 50% of liberal students feel uncomfortable expressing a controversial view in class. So I think we need to work to foster a culture where people put forward their ideas and are not necessarily afraid to argue for them and to be argued against. I really think we need kind of a reinforcement of principles of civil discourse, of truth-seeking by academic leadership, by faculty in classes, in orientation sessions and university communications. And I think this just, given the current culture, needs to more or less be continual. Kind of one pronouncement at the beginning of the year isn't sufficient. I think we need to keep coming back again and again the value of open discourse. To my mind, we need to sort of foster various character strengths and virtues to help with a more robust culture of intellectual discourse. Testimony from students at Harvard that not only would some students and many students self-censor, but students confess to even lying about the positions they actually held to avoid ostracization and difficult social dynamics. So I mean, not only are people hesitant to say what they think, but they're even lying about what they think. This is not a healthy culture, and so I think we need to foster one where and help students develop various virtues for a healthy academic community, of courage to speak their mind even on controversial matters, honesty to be upfront about what they think, patience to bear with positions of the other side that they might find disagreeable, justice to allow each person to articulate their views, humility to have a sense that one might have something to learn from others, from the opposing side. So again, I think we need to do more to leverage viewpoint diversity. I see there's a question, so happy to take that before moving on to what I think can be done with faculty.
Oh, okay,
That,
I thought we were supposed to wait. I was just trying to get in the queue. But, I mean, I agree with all of that. How do you do it? Are you going to get to how you do it?
I will, but yeah, let's come back to this in
Okay.
the Q&A. I've got various other ideas about how to encourage this as well.
Okay.
Happy to take this up again. Okay, so I mean, a lot of that is perhaps not so controversial. I mean, there are certainly counter positions with regard to need for respect for feelings and identity of students, and we can come back to those as well. But I mean, I think many would embrace a need for greater openness. But I do think one of the trickiest questions here are concern intellectual diversity of faculty and what, if anything, should be done. And I think a lot of bad proposals can be put forward here as well. But I do think there's, to my mind, a need for a more intellectually diverse faculty. I think presentation of diverse viewpoints is often not going to be enough. I think we need an intellectually diverse faculty so that those viewpoints can be presented in a compelling and strongest possible manner. I think we need a more intellectually diverse faculty so that those alternative viewpoints are presented sufficiently frequently so that there has to be engagement with them. I think we need an intellectually diverse faculty to help prevent a culture of self-censorship. I think we need a sufficiently intellectually diverse faculty for graduate student mentorship as well. But how do we bring it about? Well, one of the earlier attempts was kind of grounded in David Horowitz's proposed academic Bill of Rights to protect intellectual diversity. And reading through this again, I do think many of the statements are actually really, really good and reasonable here. How they were used is another matter, but what he puts forward is no political, ideological, or religious orthodoxy will be imposed on professors. No faculty shall be hired or fired or denied promotion or tenure on the basis of his or her political or religious beliefs. Maintain a posture of organizational neutrality with respect to substantive disagreements that divide researchers on questions within or outside their fields of inquiry. So again, going through these, to my mind, what he states is very reasonable. This was then used in certain states to try to kind of impose quotas on the number of conservative faculty members, and so I think was criticized on the grounds of this by the AUP, by Stanley Fish. So the criticisms do vary, but while again the proposal itself I think is reasonable, the use is a different matter. So again, criticized for sometimes used to enforce quotas, criticized for kind of insufficient respect for autonomy and scholarly standards of academic disciplines. If we are advancing towards knowledge, then not every question is still equally open to dispute. Perhaps we should allow for any piece of knowledge to be challenged, but there is variation with regard to what is known and the levels of evidence that have been provided over time, and that this really does need to be respected. And then criticisms also by trying to use this proposal to enforce change from the top down, from either institutions' leadership or state's government and so on. And then I think Stanley Fish also puts forward a reasonable criticism for the use of some of these ideas, arguing that intellectual diversity isn't necessarily really a value in and of itself. It is, I think, like viewpoint diversity, a means. I think it fosters the pursuit of knowledge in many contexts, but really the ultimate end, the ultimate goal is that knowledge. So again, other than quotas, what alternatives are there? Keith Whittington in his article proposes a handful of other alternatives, which I have somewhat mixed feelings about, potentially building new institutions that allow for more conservative viewpoints, establishing new centers within existing universities, leadership emphasizing conservative views are in fact welcome, all of which may have some value, but I don't think necessarily bring about what we most need, which is engagement within a particular discipline, within department. A new institution, a new center has the danger of being isolated. I do think it's still of some value potentially when one's looking at the discipline as a whole, but I think many of the most robust discussions take place within a discipline, within a department. And so I think we need engagement, again, within departments, within disciplines, but I also think we need to preserve, disciplinary autonomy, and ideally we want to hire scholars on the grounds of their abilities and contributions, not because of the particular ideological viewpoints that they hold. So how might we do this? As I've reflected on this question, I do think not the only explanation, but I do think a central one for the lack of intellectual diversity may be the research areas in which departments choose to hire, either formally by declaring a search only within a particular topic area, or informally with regard to the topical areas that are prioritized in open searches. So for example, in my own field, public health, we simply, as far as I'm aware, have never conducted a search for scholars pursuing the intersection of religion and health, or marriage and health, or pro-life approaches to women's health. It would sort of almost be beyond the consideration of the institution to ever do such a thing. But I think the empirical research suggests that these are important areas of inquiry, often carried out not within public health, but within other departments, say sociology departments. And moreover, if we were to hire in areas like this, and we'd have probably a much more diverse, intellectually diverse range of applicants. But instead, we would maybe focus on health disparities, which again, I think is also an important topic, but which is going to attract a different distribution of applicants. So I think if we were to diversify the set of research topics that we prioritized or hired in, either formally or informally, this could lead, we could preserve disciplinary autonomy of departments, but also lead to a more intellectually diverse faculty. So, again, I think there are many priorities that need to be taken into account in faculty hiring decisions. And so I would put forward as one principle to be weighed amongst others the following faculty intellectual diversity hiring principle. I first articulated this in an op-ed in the Harvard Crimson newspaper last year, but statement, and again, open to kind of refinement, critique here, but would be as follows. When a research area requires attention to viewpoints that are held by a large portion of the population and that exert significant influence on policy or society, it would be advantageous to have someone on faculty who either holds the view or conducts research on those who do hold the view. More specifically, when such viewpoints concern values or concern matters on which there is not scholarly consensus, it would be advantageous to have a faculty member who actually holds the view. In contrast, when there is evidence-based scholarly consensus that the relevant view is false, it would be advantageous to have someone who studies those who hold the view. So again, it's not all viewpoints are relevant, not all topical areas are relevant, but when some viewpoint is really held by a large portion of the population and it exerts significant influence on policy or society, then have someone who either holds the view or studies those who hold the view. It would be advantageous to do so, to hire in these areas. So universities might then try to particularly hard to hire faculty who hold disfavored or controversial views when those views are held by a large portion of the public and have not been clearly refuted and influence culture and policy. So one, again, still with these faculty searches in particular topic areas, hires the best candidate independent of political view or identity. But I do think searches in these areas would lead to a greater intellectual diversity and increase the topical areas that disciplines are pursuing. So, as a series of examples of application of this principle. Some time ago, I remember expressing to a colleague surprise that many philosophy departments and modern research universities would never have a scholar who studied the philosophy of Aquinas. And his response was, well, for most, it would be like having a professor studying the philosophy of unicorns. It would be interesting technical questions maybe, but who cares? And again, I think this intellectual diversity faculty hiring principle distinguishes between these two cases. Aquinas' philosophy powerfully influences Catholic teaching, affects over 1 billion people in the world. Unicorns are neither believed in nor influential. So again, I think on this principle, it would be good for a philosophy department to hire a scholar of Aquinas. And I think doing so would, again, lead to greater intellectual diversity within philosophy departments. As kind of a negative example, one might take UFOs. There are quite a few people who in this country who believe in UFOs, but at present, it really doesn't exert much influence on policy or society. If that began to change, if we started heavily investing in science of UFOs, then, well, maybe it would be helpful to have someone who believed in UFOs or studied those who did. But at present, not really needed. Or with regard to positions on slavery, this is just not a position that's widely held at present. But at a different time in our country's history, it was, and it did exert influence. And so in such a context, if we were to rewind 170 years, it would, I think, be advantageous in an academic setting to have someone on faculty who believed slavery was right, to try to refute them, to try to influence society through these discussions. With something like young earth creationism, again, positions widely held in the United States, possibly influential, certainly rejected by scholarly consensus. But I do think a department who had a scholar who studied those who held such beliefs could really empower the department to have greater influence on the general public. Or if we take denial of global warming, certainly reasonably widely held, influential position, certainly at least partially wrong, but it's complicated. It also concerns issues of values, what is to be done, and I think there's reasonable room for disagreement there. I think having both types of scholars here, both those who study members of the population who reject global warming, but also who are engaged deeply in climate science is valuable. And even here, I think some diversity is helpful. This article by Brown in 2023 by a climate scientist who very much believes global warming is a problem, but was starting forest fires, said he couldn't get published in Nature if he would to acknowledge other causes and explanations for the increase in forest fires beyond global warming. It's sort of the lack of intellectual diversity, he argues, is actually impeding our science. So I do think greater intellectual diversity of faculty would have the potential to reshape what are considered central versus fringe topics within a discipline, kind of broaden the range of topics we're studying, reshape editorial willingness to publish these in high-ranked journals, reshape grant funding around these topics, alter not who's just hired, but promoted, provide student supervision on these topics, essentially help begin to reverse some of that discrimination that we saw earlier around alternative perspectives. I think with regard to graduate students, it would help also end what I see as a vicious cycle. Without faculty studying these topics, prospective students might decide it's not worth even applying or face rejection for lack of advisors, the absence of graduate students on these topics, and reinforce perception that departments don't need to hire in these areas. I do think this is not the whole of, but part of what's going on as we see increasingly declining numbers of conservatives in academia. So again, I think we could do targeted searches on topics that might expand intellectual diversity, not hire according to the person's ideologic beliefs, but simply hire in areas where you're going to have a more intellectually diverse range of applicants, including things like military history, Aquinas' philosophy, study of character, not just personality, but character within psychology, religion and health, approaches to women's health, and so on, and so forth. I think coming from within the structures of the university itself, rather than being imposed from the administration or the government, I think individual departments could kind of internally review their own teaching and research on what are topics that have been neglected. Again, this can be done while preserving the autonomy of departments. I think there could be internal data collection on intellectual and ideological diversities done within the department, while again retaining the department's autonomy. I do think there's a role for the university administration to facilitate this, and somewhat more of a top-down approach, again, not forcing quotas in any sense. But I think if they were to endow professorships, for example, in underrepresented research areas, such as those I've listed above, that would help facilitate these sorts of searches. So I do think investing money could help in practice facilitate this faculty intellectual diversity hiring principle. And again, I do think similar reflection could take place with regard to grant review, editorial processes, awards committees, graduate student admissions. But I don't think any of this is ever likely to be adequately addressed without a more intellectually diverse faculty. I think without that, discrimination in these other areas is likely to continue. Perhaps more contingently, and this is my last point with regard to mechanisms to try to facilitate a greater intellectual diversity while retaining scholarly standards and the autonomy of disciplines, would be thinking carefully and critically about student admissions. And I think this is in part shaped by ideological imbalance of university administrators. There's even more extreme lack of balance with university of administrators than there is with faculty. And this piece by Abrams, 2018, at that time suggested U.S. liberal to conservative faculty ratio was 6-1, but with administrators, 12-1, with New England administrators, 25-1. And I do think this likely affects undergraduate student admissions when the admissions officers are so highly imbalanced in one direction. I just don't see how it cannot exert influence on student admission decisions. I've been surprised how little data there is on this. Perhaps some partial evidence, but I wouldn't say either of these analyses are definitive or compelling, but partial evidence of discrimination, especially against socially conservative or religiously conservative applicants. But I think more needs to be done with regard to the empirical study here. I have had this more anecdotally, but a Harvard colleague reflecting on the experience of his children and the friends of his children said applicants believed, direct quote, that it was important to present as progressive as possible in their applications, regardless of their actual beliefs. Peers who had difficulty hiding their conservative views generally had to settle for lesser ranked schools. I would not in any way embrace conservative affirmative action for conservative students. I think students should be chosen according to their strengths holistically. So I would not want affirmative action for conservative students, but maybe for admissions officers. I think there's perhaps a reasonably compelling case to be made that undergraduate admissions committees should be more politically balanced than they are at present. And this is now moving into sort of pure speculation, but I have consequently wondered whether many of our current problems in the university with regard to viewpoint diversity, faculty hiring, speaker cancellation, self-censorship might themselves be resolved if the administration were more ideologically balanced. I don't think we'd need perfect balance, but perhaps we could aim over time towards achieving, say, a 2-1 liberal to conservative ratio of administrators. Unlike trying to impose analogous faculty quotas, which I would reject, I do think balancing administrators a bit more could be reasonable and wouldn't involve any abandonment of disciplinary autonomy. I do think there are real consequences, and this is, again, moving more towards my own views rather than sort of the data itself, but I do think lack of absence of conservative viewpoints has led to less rigor in arguments because positions can be presumed. I think it's led to a neglect of good conservative ideas and entire fields of inquiry. I think it's led to a neglect of focus on student formation and on character, because the view is sort of autonomy above all and sort of prioritizing negative notions of freedom. So we don't want to do anything to help shape students. I think it's led to subjective notions of truth going unopposed. In some circles, sort of an emphasis on power over truth, and some circles, not uniformly, certainly, but on activism replacing scholarship. I think also an incapacity to understand and serve the whole of society. So I think the consequences here are real, and I think do real harm to the university in their principal knowledge-based truth-seeking goals of the generation, preservation, and transmission of knowledge. I think viewpoint and intellectual diversity could be viewed as a strength to be sought after, cultivated, developed. I do think, again, it contributes to the capacity to seek truth and knowledge, to find common ground, to contribute to the common good. I think it can increase a sense of welcome and belonging for all and civil discourse. I think if we embrace the notion that what unites us, where we find belonging, is that all views are welcome and that we're engaged together in this pursuit of truth. I think that itself can create a sense of welcome and belonging. And so again, I think increasing viewpoint and intellectual diversity has the potential to accomplish all of these goods. I think without it, pursuit of truth will suffer. An institution will be less able to serve those with different viewpoints. There will be a loss of public trust. And I think our universities will be less able to serve our democracies. I've written in other pieces, I have wondered, because these issues are in fact particularly extreme at schools of public health, if we're now in fact only capable of understanding and serving and supplying public health education to only half of the US population and its potential administrations. What are we doing to help shape conservative thinking within public health? I think a school of public health should be desperately seeking those conservative public health leaders of the future and helping to form their thinking. Are we really doing this? And again, I think these issues have real consequences and real questions around whether academic discourse was sufficiently oriented towards the pursuit of truth during COVID-19. The slogan, "Follow the science," was often then replaced by not science, but values, overwhelmingly liberal, progressive values. There was a persecution of dissenting perspectives, even those who came from more liberal ideological approaches. If you disagreed with the majority, you were shut down and often persecuted. I think the contribution of this, therefore, to general well-being was often questionable, and I think led to real losses with regard to education and with more disadvantaged communities, and dramatically lower levels of trust in science. And Pew suggests trust in science was increasing, in fact, going down in institutions generally, but increasing in science till COVID-19, and then dropped dramatically during the COVID-19 pandemic. So again, the consequences, I think, of not having intellectual and viewpoint diversity are real. Are we going to do anything about it? To my mind, this is the central question on this topic for universities today. Mill argues that when there's an advantage to those with the prevailing opinion, there is often little interest in securing justice for those of the dissenting opinion. And to my mind, that's a lot of what's going on. There's just not interest in addressing this. But I think we should ask ourselves, are decisions being made to intentionally exclude perspectives? A great deal of evidence that in faculty hiring, many DEI statements were being used precisely in this manner. Are efforts being made for greater exposure to reasonable viewpoint diversity? Is there anything being done in this regard? Are any efforts being made with regard to intellectual diversity in hiring? I do think ultimately these should come within the university, from within departments, if change is going to be real and lasting, and if we're going to preserve the autonomy of departments and disciplines. This was a quote from a book by Wolff, cited in Heathington's paper, which I found quite striking. Wolff was apparently an anarchist philosopher, but wrote 50 years ago, "The politicalization of the university invites the ever-present threat of pressure, censorship, and witch hunting by conservative forces in society at large. The universities at present are sanctuaries for social critics who would find it very hard to gain a living elsewhere in society. Where else are anarchists, socialists, and followers of other unpopular persuasions accorded titles, honors, and the absolute security of academic tenure? Let the university once declare that it is a political actor, and its faculty will be investigated, its charter revoked, and its tax-exempt status forthwith removed." This was some time ago. This hasn't happened yet, and still hasn't happened yet. But this is what the current administration is threatening. It's interesting that Wolff sort of, even when ratios were just 2-to-1, saw this as a as a real danger. I do think under excessive partisanship, it becomes more difficult to challenge supposedly established orthodoxies. I think environments become less hospitable to those with differing views. I think the university is more likely to be co-opted for political purposes, to lose its academic nature in the pursuit of truth. I think it's more likely to become a vehicle of political action. That said, I do think there's real space, and I genuinely believe this, for ideological institutions of higher learning. I think if an institution wanted it to declare itself purely progressive or purely democratic institution of higher education, I think that would be reasonable, just as I think there should be space for religious institutions to do so as well. But if that's the case, I think it should be explicitly declared, and there should be an awareness of this going in. And I think the institution itself would be healthier. Smith College, for instance, I think the liberal to conservative ratio of students and faculty is something like 55-1. It's basically already taken place there. Why not just declare it? I actually think the academic discourse would be healthier if that were the case. But are some of our other institutions all that far off at 23-1? At Harvard? I think with regard to the current state of affairs, if universities proceed on their present course, the case for the accusation that the university has become partisan is increasingly strong. I do think reform is needed. I think it will ultimately be only effective long-term if it comes from within. But I think the power and decision-making and responsibility now lies principally, not exclusively, but principally with liberals and progressives within the university. Is there, for the most part, not exclusively those that currently hold the power and decision making. So I'm not sure what is going to happen. I do think this is an important issue, and it'll be interesting to see the results. So thank you all for listening and for being present. And again, happy to take questions, critiques, comments, and so on and so forth. But thank you all again.
Thank you, Tyler, for the talk. Very interesting. I am, as a moderator, I'm going to ask the first question, and then we'll open up the floor to whoever else wants to ask questions. I agree with almost all of what you said there, but I feel like you did not, you were too polite in making the case. You didn't make the case in a strong enough way, and consequently, your remedies were far too weak as well. As an example, many departments simply will not hire today anybody with the wrong politics. You didn't say anything that's strong, but I think that's a fact. And expressing the wrong politics can be career-ending in many fields. I can't think of any other way to explain why across every department of humanities and arts at Stanford and most social science departments, the number of junior faculty who are right of center politically is 0. I would imagine that's true at Harvard as well. You won't find a single junior faculty member in any humanities department at Stanford even expressing right of center views. And, that comes to your remedies. Your remedies seem to presume that we all recognize there's a problem with viewpoint diversity and what can we do about it and how can we get together and address this. And they don't seem to recognize, or the remedies don't seem to sort of take into account the reality that many faculty and many administrators believe their discipline and their university should be engaged in progressive activism. So with that said, my question to you is, what can be done about departments and fields of study that literally blackball anybody with the wrong political views? How would you suggest addressing that? I didn't see anything in your remedies that sort of would come close to addressing that. I don't want the president to be making decisions here, but I don't think your remedies, why don't we all get together and, support viewpoint diversity, will go very far either.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a reasonable criticism. I don't, as I said, I don't think long-term change is going to occur in a way which respects the autonomy of disciplines and departments unless that change comes from within. So, I suppose, my argument is perhaps trying to appeal to those with power, those who have ensured a political homogeneity to reconsider this and to point to the costs and what's at stake, to try to say, yes, what we've done thus far has not been good and has led to this homogeneity. Let's reconsider whether this approach is best. And even if a handful of departments were to do so, okay, in my conversations with the members of the philosophy department at Harvard, for example, I think there could be openness to some of these ideas with regard to the 200 members of the Council of Academic Freedom at Harvard. I think a desire to see some of this enacted. So let's bring together those groups that see the potential for argument for real change to be effective. To my mind, in terms of more dramatic actions, the only ones I've come up with that I think both, in some sense, preserve departmental and disciplinary autonomy and would help move the needle would be the endowed professorships in areas that are underrepresented, which might have a much broader range of conservatives that apply and be interested. So, for example, we have a Scalia chair in the law school with certain terms and conditions. I think, and this would be controversial, but the School of Public Health could endow a chair, for example, for a scholar devoted to pro-life approaches to women's health. This would not be legal engagement, but 46% of women in the United States think abortion is wrong. Who is serving that group? Forget the legal debates or access debates. Who is serving this group of women in the context of an unplanned pregnancy? I think having a scholar within the School of Public Health would be valuable. Would be valuable to public health, and I can pretty much guarantee you it would lead to greater ideological diversity within the school. So I do think it would require a lot of money, but I think this is the time to do it. Endowing chairs in these topics are one way to not fully force, but very strongly encourage greater intellectual diversity. But I take your criticism. I think that's the only suggestion that I've put forward that would sort of really ensure a broadening rather than just kind of trying to argue for it and trying to bring people along to say this is important, this needs to be addressed.
Richard, you're up. You're muted, Richard.
There we go. Thanks, Jeffrey. Fascinating presentation, Tyler, and thank you for doing this important work. Last week, I was part of a conclave of faculty from across the University of California trying to come together to grapple with this issue and some related ones. So the stuff that you've already pulled together, I think would be really helpful to our efforts. I'm wondering, whether your slides can be shared, and what your sort of publication plans are in this area?
Yeah, I'm happy to share slides. Probably this summer, I'll try to turn this into a paper, and so happy to post and share the draft of that pre-publication as well. I'm hoping by July this is turned into a paper, but again, happy to pass on the slides even now.
Great, thank you,
Matt.
Thanks, Tyler. Both for your ongoing courageous and principled work and for the presentation. My question is about the endowed chairs. It seems to me like no matter how you frame it, what the topic would be, whether it's Aquinas or pro-life approaches to women's health, that somebody will always raise their hand from whatever ideological perspective they might be coming from and say, oh, I do that. I'm willing to do that. And so the person that gets hired is not necessarily actually increasing viewpoint diversity. So are there ways that you would suggest structuring a committee for an endowed chair? I mean, are there ways to guard against that problem of just saying donors giving to an endowed chair, it going to, administration, and then getting kind of captured?
Yeah, I mean, I think critical to this process would be choosing the selection committee, the search committee, rightly, and ensuring that there was greater ideological balance within the search committee, and perhaps choosing the search committee to be faculty members throughout a school, not just a department, or when allowed. And obviously there are restrictions with respect to university policies, but potentially choosing faculty on the search committee across the university who value, who see the value, and who want to encourage and foster such intellectual diversity as well. I mean, my view is I'd still be of the opinion that if it was very clear, hands down, that the best scholar in this area on Aquinas, say, were of more liberal persuasion, then I still don't think it would be unreasonable to hire. Any given hire, I don't think is going to guarantee greater intellectual diversity. But I think if there were, say, 30 endowed professorships suddenly announced tomorrow in these sorts of areas, I think some of them would be successful in broadening the intellectual diversity. But I do, and this was in response to Jeff's comment as well. I do think unless there's some desire for this and a recognition of its value, it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to do. It's going to be hard to make these changes. So I do think some of the activity needs to be convincing colleagues of the value, of the importance of intellectual and viewpoint diversity.
Just for a very brief follow-up, I'm not familiar with typical protocols, but is it possible to have that search committee identified during the fundraising phase for an endowed chair? Or endowed professorship?
I think those policies are going to vary by institution. I mean, it seems conceivable that would indeed be would be a possibility.
Thank you.
Julia, you are up next.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for this talk. I'm wondering how merit plays into this process. In my mind, if we get back to merit more and held search committees more accountable on that, we would probably increase viewpoint diversity quite a bit. Because what I saw happening in my own institution, Berkeley, and also surrounding places, University of California, is that particularly with DEI coming in strong, it gave people liberty to just hire whoever they liked. And it was not so much anymore about the number of papers. I mean, it's difficult to quantify in different areas. You're in the humanities more. I'm in STEM. We have pretty clear quantitative measures of merits that are generally used. So, for example, publications in peer-reviewed journals and how good those publications are. But I feel that there was a real change in hiring practices away from that and towards hiring for lived experience, identity, and in the end, very nebulous criteria where you could just hire whoever you wanted to hire. And that opened the door to hire people that you just like, and you like to have lunch with and talk about politics because they all agree with you, right? And I feel, I think one way to sustainably go back to something better would be to hold the search committees accountable if they really hiring the best candidate, and for them to also have to show why they think they're hiring the best candidate. Our university has done this around DI. They canceled searches if the candidate was chosen wasn't the right candidate from a DI perspective, but they never go like, why do you choose the candidate who has one paper if you have other candidates that have 10 papers and give a better talk?
Yeah, I mean, I very much do think a return to merit-based criteria in faculty searches would help, and I do think many of the mandatory DEI statements have been used to screen out faculty who are conservative or who hold more intellectually diverse viewpoints, or who don't have the right set of identity. So I do think those practices should come to an end, and I've been heartened that Harvard has replaced its the Faculty of Arts Sciences at least has replaced its mandatory DEI statements with broader service statements. So again, I think a return to merit-based hiring would be good. But I also don't think it's sufficient. It's a helpful step. None of these matters are sufficient. I mean, in my own department in epidemiology at the School of Public Health at Harvard, I actually think we've done a superb job in the 15 years I've been there at pretty uniformly taking the best and strongest candidate. Every search committee I've served on, I do feel that has been the outcome, and I've generally felt that way with the result of faculty searches that I've not served on. But we have pretty uniform set of ideological political perspectives within the department. So again, I think it's not enough. But we could in principle, but with current structures, we would never hire someone in looking at the intersection of the epidemiology of religion and health, for example. The fact that I'm there is almost an accident because of my statistical and methods work. That's why I was hired. But I think if we did, we'd have a slightly higher chance of having more ideological diversity within the department. So I do think the areas that are hired in also matter. So yes, return to merit-based hiring, but that's often not going to be enough. I think the areas in which we hire are also quite critical.
And also the taboo topics that you mentioned with the chairs, I think was a great idea. But also, how can we teach about these taboo topics, to undergraduates, because they also not exposed to these thoughts at all, right?
Yeah, and again, I mean, I put forward a handful of proposals how this could potentially be done in classroom, even with a fairly politically homogenous faculty. But I think those efforts are only going to go so far, and I think it's going to be difficult, as I said, without faculty actually holding these views. So I do think undergraduate education, dissemination of knowledge, and our own pursuit and generation of knowledge would be advanced considerably by a more intellectually diverse faculty.
Thank you.
John, you are up.
Hi, yes, thanks so much for your very thoughtful talk. I'm just wanting to talk about an intellectual issue, which may be rather niche, but on the other hand, I think it's central to this problem. I'll start by mentioning one untouchable area that you did not mention, although you glanced at it, and that is group racial differences in cognitive ability. That is an absolutely untouchable area. And I had a little debate with a reporter from one of the, like Inside Higher Ed or one of those things, about this issue. And we talked about facts. I mean, there are facts like test differences and so on between groups. And he immediately said, that's racist. In other words, it's racist to make a factual claim, which reminded me of the wonderful David Hume, of whom I'm a huge fan, who separated factual claims from values. And it seems to be a lot of the bias that we're talking about here deals with values. And because there's no separation between the factual claim and the value, they go on endlessly. So it seems to me that would be the separation of the factuality, the truth value of a claim, independently of the values that it evokes in people, would be a very useful thing to emphasize. And I wonder what you thought about that. Thanks again for your talk.
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree that we should have kind of a fact value distinction. Where they interface with each other, I think is also important. But as I indicated earlier, I think the blurring of that distinction in public health during the COVID-19 pandemic also had profound consequences. I mean, my view is that, and I know others would dispute this, but question of any fact and any value should be a fair topic of debate in an academic setting. One wants to do so respectfully and in a civil manner, but I don't think the university can carry out its work, pursuit of knowledge, as best as possible, unless we have a culture where that is the case. And I mean, I do think a powerful way to try to address the culture of self-censorship is to have open public debates by two people willing to engage in civil discourse, to treat each other respectfully on the most contentious topics of the day, to see how this can be done, how this can be done well. And then I think it kind of diffuses some of the tension, not all, certainly, but some around these topics, and other topics perhaps seem, well, not quite as controversial as they used to be. So, while Harvard's done a little bit of this, they have not selected the most contentious topics of the day for their civil discourse work, and I think that's what we need to do to, in some sense, restore the sense that all topics can be disputed. So I think it needs to be done in a thoughtful way, but I do think these disputes should happen.
Let me just add, in connection with the COVID issue, if the people recommending these very extreme measures had been forced to articulate their values, they would have had to come out and say, health is our primary value, and we actually don't care about economics, social issues, education, and all the rest, which would have put their recommendation in a proper perspective. So I just think this is a generally useful way to look at things. Thanks.
I completely agree. Yeah, thank you.
Just though, taking this example of COVID policy and having debates, I think points to the practical roadblocks of implementing any of this. As an epidemiologist, you probably know that Jay Bhattacharya, professor at here at Stanford, because of his views on COVID policy, was turned into a pariah at the Stanford Medical School. No one would talk to him. No one would discuss things with him. He was, by his own account, which he gave us in this group, as well as has said publicly, he was treated as a non-entity. There were over 100 Stanford faculty members, many from the medical school, who signed a petition trying to get him punished or fired. Not one of them ever came up and discussed his ideas with him. Not one was willing to do that. Not one, when we invited them to a debate in this forum or any other forum, was willing to debate him. Not one of them wanted to even be seen with him. When, the kind of things he was suggesting, not only were they, not way out there, they're now many of his suggestions are now sort of accepted public policy. But nobody on the other side was even willing to discuss privately or publicly with him any of his ideas.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a real problem, and I think as I suggested earlier, I think the university's gotten itself into a bit of a mess in this regard. I think we've created an unhealthy culture, academic culture, one where robust debate is not encouraged or fostered, where the tools are no longer arguments, but social pressure. And I think we need a change in culture. And I don't think policy, even the best policy, is ultimately going to bring that about. I think, as I said before, I think some of this needs to come from within. And I think there need to be a robust defense of the nature of the university as a truth-seeking institution and of the need for debate, the need for coming into engagement with opposing views to bring about better evidence, stronger arguments, move towards knowledge. And so I do think there's a little bit of a chicken and the egg problem. I think I do think the intellectual diversity of faculty is an issue, and the lack of that really contributes to the problem. So I think this is an area we need to work on, but I think simultaneously need to work on the present time for, as I said, greater leveraging of the existing viewpoint diversity, including among students, trying to alter this culture of self-censorship, trying to bring about and facilitate, foster, create more debates on controversial issues. And I think doing that will take time. It takes a long time for culture to change, but gradually change the culture. But yeah, I think what happened to Jay Acharya is simply indicative of the unhealthy academic culture that we've found ourselves in. I experienced perhaps not something quite so extreme, but somewhat analogous, and have colleagues here at Harvard who have as well. And in some ways that can happen even without ill intention, when the culture itself is one of self-censorship and presumption of orthodoxies. Then there's real social cost. Even someone who interpersonally might be sympathetic to even being seen with someone who's viewed as having deviated from those orthodoxies. So we've had some interesting discussion and debate on the Council of Academic Freedom Listserv at Harvard around sort of role of distinctively courses with distinctively religious perspectives, and is this indoctrination, and what is the bounds and scope? But I think there's much greater risk at present with regard to indoctrination and presumption of progressive orthodoxies at present. And I think we need a culture of more robust debate. And I think the university can take a hands-on approach and simply organize, facilitate debates on the most contentious topics. Choose the speakers wisely, find ones who are willing to engage civilly. But I think it could go a long way.
Well, it is just about noon, and I don't see any other hands. So let me thank you, Tyler, for your really thoughtful, provocative talk and discussion. Really appreciated it. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation and for hosting these seminars, and wish you all the best at Stanford, and remain hopeful that in the years ahead we'll be able to restore the university to a more truth-seeking and healthier academic institution. But thank you all.
I do hope so. Thank you.